I want to start this one off honestly, because something felt different out at that practice facility today, and I think you need to hear about it before we even get into the football itself. For the first time all offseason, actual fans were allowed through those gates in Henderson. Not just credentialed staff, not just reporters standing around with notebooks, but real supporters lining the sideline. And you could feel that shift in energy the second the gates opened. There's something about a training camp practice once real people are watching that changes the entire atmosphere. And today, that atmosphere was buzzing. But if you followed camp football long enough, you already know the pattern. The second you let yourself relax and soak in the good vibes, the sport finds a way to remind you it doesn't care about your mood. And today, that reminder had a specific name attached to it, one I'll get to in a few minutes. But first, I have to walk you through some roster movement that dropped today, because I think it tells you a lot about what's actually happening behind closed doors with this front office. Multiple reports confirmed that the organization brought running back James Robinson in for a look. On its own, that's a mildly interesting footnote. But then you find out there was another back getting evaluated as well. And when you stack that on top of the fact that Miles Sanders already got a workout with this team just last week, suddenly you're looking at 3 different veteran running backs auditioning in the span of roughly 2 weeks. That is not random. That is a front office quietly telling you they're not fully comfortable with the depth sitting behind their top backfield options right now. Let's talk specifically about Robinson for a second, because his name still carries weight if you've been paying attention to this league for a while. Back in 2020, he put together a season that had people around the entire NFL talking about him as maybe the best undrafted breakout story in recent memory. Since then, it's been a much bumpier road, injuries and inconsistency chipping away at that early promise, but he did resurface this year, putting up real production in the UFL, which at minimum tells you the tank isn't empty. Here's why bringing him in makes complete sense from a business standpoint. If Vegas signs him, there's essentially zero financial risk involved. No long-term commitment weighing down the cap sheet. Yes, his injury history is a real concern, and yes, he's not the same explosive home run threat he was during his career year, but if the goal is simply stacking a proven veteran body behind the younger names already in that room, there's almost no downside to a move like this. Would I personally be thrilled watching him soak up meaningful snaps this season? Not particularly. I still believe in the upside sitting in that young room, and honestly, there are other available veteran backs I'd rather see wearing silver and black over Robinson specifically. But depth wins you football games in November and December, and you don't build a real roster by only chasing exciting names. Now here's a piece of news today that genuinely made me exhale a little. One of the promising young defensive pieces who left practice early on Friday with a scare was back out there today, moving around with his teammates like nothing ever happened. Clint Kubiak had already tried to calm everyone down about it, framing it as pure caution from the training staff rather than anything serious, but there's always that nagging discomfort sitting in your stomach until you actually see the guy jogging around on his own 2 feet again. And getting that visual reassurance the day before pads finally go on for the first time this camp, the timing on that couldn't have worked out better, because tomorrow flips a switch. Tomorrow, this camp stops being about install periods and walk-through spacing and starts being about actual collision, actual contact, actual football. And every single storyline I'm about to walk you through gets magnified the second real physicality enters the equation. Alright, let's get into the moment that completely took over my notes today, because if you've been tracking this quarterback situation as closely as I have, you probably sensed this was coming eventually. Fernando Mendoza has been quietly stacking together an impressive camp under Clint Kubiak. Sharp reads, clean footwork, the kind of steady week-to-week improvement that gets people inside the building talking in hallways. Today was not that version of him. Today was ugly, and I'm not going to soften that for you, because pretending otherwise would be lying to you as a viewer who actually wants the real picture of where this team stands. From his very first rep, something looked off. He was holding onto the football a half second too long in spots where decisiveness matters most, second-guessing throws he had been ripping through cleanly just days earlier. And once that hesitation crept in, it started snowballing fast. One of his deep shots sailed short of where it needed to land, underthrowing Malik Benson on what should have been a real chunk play down the field. And Dame Rich closed that window in time to bat the pass away before it ever had a chance to become something bigger. That kind of miss stings, but on its own, it doesn't define an entire practice. Quarterbacks miss throws. That's simply part of the sport. But then 7-on-7 work rolled around, and Greedy Vance jumped a route, stepped in front of the throw, and picked him off clean, marking the very first interception Fernando Mendoza has thrown through his entire training camp. Sit with that for a second. 4 practices deep, And it took until today for the defense to finally cash in on a real mistake from him. That tells you exactly how clean his process had genuinely been up to this point, which somehow makes today's regression even more jarring by comparison. And unfortunately, it didn't stop there either. Once Mendoza rotated down into second-team reps, the entire unit around him seemed to lose its rhythm completely, stacking penalty after penalty across multiple team periods. Now, I want to be fair here, because it's easy to dump everything on one young quarterback when a whole offensive group collectively has a sloppy stretch. But optics are unavoidable in training camp, and when the #1 overall pick sits at the center of a rough sequence like this, people are going to talk about it regardless of how much responsibility genuinely belongs to him individually versus everyone else on that field. Here's what actually gives me some peace tonight, though, and I think it's worth slowing all the way down on. This organization has clearly liked what they've seen out of Mendoza across the bigger picture, especially how he's handled learning behind a genuinely established veteran presence like Kirk Cousins instead of trying to force his way into the spotlight before he's ready. And his real proving ground arrives tomorrow, the very first padded practice of this entire camp, the moment where scheme finally gives way to physicality, where every single read carries actual consequences attached to it. Clint Kubiak addressed this exact situation directly, sitting down with David Carr on ESPN, and I think his response tells you everything you need to know about how this coaching staff is framing this stretch internally. He talked about being genuinely pleased with Mendoza's overall trajectory, praising his work ethic and pointing specifically to his level-headedness, especially given how much adversity gets thrown at a rookie quarterback early in this process. His core point was simple. The guys who can absorb a genuinely rough day and still show up the next morning ready to be better, those are usually the ones who end up finding real, sustainable success at this level. That's not just generic coach speak filling airtime. That's a specific, intentional signal about exactly what this staff is measuring right now. And it isn't the mistakes themselves. And credit where it's due, David Carr didn't let Kubiak coast through with some soft, forgettable question either. He asked directly what Mendoza specifically needs to show this staff to prove he's actually capable of winning that starting job outright. And Kubiak's answer was refreshingly precise. He said the #1 thing he's watching for is whether the 10 other players on that field visibly elevate their level of play the moment Mendoza steps into the huddle. Not just clean stat lines, not just the complete absence of mistakes. He referenced today's exact sequence as a live, real-time example, throwing that interception on one snap and then coming right back the very next play with a clean, confident completion. That immediate bounce back, refusing to let one bad rep snowball into 3 or 4 more, is precisely the trait he said he's evaluating above everything else. So yes, there are going to be growing pains here. Plenty of them, as Mendoza keeps working through the rest of this camp and eventually into preseason action. Today wasn't pretty. I won't dress it up as anything else. But how he responds over these next several practices, especially with pads finally on tomorrow for the first time, is going to tell us a whole lot more about where his trajectory is actually heading than one rocky Sunday ever could on its own. Now let's shift toward the guy who's been quietly doing exactly what a locked-in, established starting quarterback is supposed to do this entire camp. Because while everybody's attention got pulled toward the rookie's rough outing, Kirk Cousins just kept building something genuinely special on the other side of practice. His connection with Brock Bowers continues to look almost unfair out there, effortless, and today gave us another clear example of that chemistry showing up live, multiple explosive completions connecting the two of them throughout the session. Bowers is rapidly cementing himself as Cousins' unquestioned first read, and honestly, that shouldn't shock anybody who has actually watched this young man play football. We already know he's operating at a level that puts him firmly in the conversation for best tight end anywhere in this league. Whatever ceiling this offense ultimately reaches this season, it's going to travel about as far as Brock Bowers is capable of carrying it on his own back. Watching that rapport continue developing this early in camp genuinely gets me excited picturing what it looks like once the lights actually come on and games start counting for real, because there's a massive difference between chemistry built during a padless summer practice and chemistry holding up against a defense bringing legitimate, live pressure. Still, as far as that starting job goes, make no mistake, it remains firmly Kirk Cousins to lose right now, full stop. But I don't want to completely bury the third name sitting in that quarterback room, because I think a lot of us, myself included on certain days, have been guilty of overlooking him simply because the Cousins and Mendoza storylines are soaking up all the available oxygen. Aiden O'Connell reportedly uncorked the single best throw of the entire practice today, connecting with E.J. Williams on a deep shot during 7-on-7 work that had the sideline audibly reacting, the kind of moment that gets an entire practice buzzing for a few minutes afterward. Nobody is talking about O'Connell right now, and honestly, I understand exactly why given everything else pulling focus, but writing him off completely would be a mistake. Is it a long shot that he ends up genuinely fighting his way into real competition for a starting role at some point this season? Sure, I won't pretend otherwise. It's far from the likely outcome. But this remains a league where circumstances shift fast and without warning. And a quarterback with O'Connell's experience quietly sitting in that room is exactly the kind of variable that can end up mattering far more than people currently expect once the regular season actually arrives. Shifting over to the defensive side of the ball now, there was a subtle but genuinely interesting development worth flagging today. Darian Porter, a player I mentioned recently as having lost his grip on a starting job to Hezekiah Masters, actually got reps with the first-team defense on the outside today. I won't pretend to know definitively what that signals moving forward, whether it's a real shift happening in the pecking order or simply the coaching staff experimenting with different combinations to see how various pieces fit alongside each other. But it's encouraging watching them continue actively exploring where everyone fits instead of locking decisions in prematurely this early in camp. Porter's situation has been fairly quiet for weeks now, so any real involvement like this is absolutely worth continuing to track closely as camp progresses. Elsewhere on that side of the football, Jamal McCoy keeps flashing in ways that are genuinely hard to ignore, looking increasingly comfortable working within the second-team unit and picking up another pass breakup today to add to his growing tally. His camp overall has honestly been a bit of a roller coaster, some really strong stretches mixed together with quieter, less noticeable ones. And until we actually see him operating in a live game setting, I'm holding off on drawing any firm conclusions either way, but the flashes are real, and real flashes matter. There's also a smaller storyline developing up front on the offensive line that deserves more attention than it's currently getting. According to reporting circulating around the building, Trey Zune III has now played 3 completely different positions across just 4 practices, rotating through center, right guard, and right tackle. That kind of positional versatility is exactly the trait Clint Kubiak values when constructing an offensive line, because it hands the coaching staff genuine options if injuries strike, or if the intended starting 5 simply doesn't shake out the way everyone originally projected heading into camp. I genuinely don't know yet where Zune ultimately settles long-term, but I could easily see him carving out a real role at either right guard or right tackle, especially considering that specific competition still feels wide open as we move deeper into camp. At the end of the day, building a line isn't about finding 5 individually talented players. It's about finding the 5 who function best together, protecting this quarterback and opening lanes for this backfield. And versatility like Zune's only makes solving that puzzle easier for the coaching staff. Finally, I want to close things out with something that genuinely stuck with me after practice wrapped today, because we got to hear directly from wide receiver Jalen Naylor, and the way he talked about his own game told me a lot about exactly where his mindset is heading into this season. He described himself as a truly complete receiver, someone capable of winning from the outside, working just as comfortably from the slot, contributing meaningfully in both the run game and through the air, essentially a player who can run the entire route tree without real limitation. But honestly, what stood out to me even more than his confidence in his own physical ability was how he framed his role within that receiver room specifically, pointing directly to leadership, wanting to actively pull the rest of that group forward with him, while also being self-aware enough to admit there's still genuine room for him to grow further into that responsibility. That combination of self-awareness paired with real ambition is exactly what you want to hear from a guy stepping directly into a wide-open opportunity. And make no mistake, that wide receiver room in Las Vegas is about as open as it realistically gets right now, which sets up a legitimate path for Naylor to establish himself as this team's clear #1 target by the time this season wraps up. Remember, this is a guy who spent his time in Minnesota playing behind proven, established names like Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson, never quite getting the runway needed to fully show what he's capable of as a true featured option. Now he's reunited with Kirk Cousins out in Las Vegas, and this genuinely feels like the real opportunity he's been quietly waiting for to prove exactly what kind of player he can become when handed the keys. One number that jumped out at me digging back through last season's data, he ranked 3rd in the entire league in separation when lined up outside. That's not a minor detail buried in a spreadsheet. That's a real translatable skill. And if that specific trait carries over cleanly into this new offensive system, Raider Nation could be looking at a receiver who quietly becomes one of the most productive weapons on this entire roster by the time this year is finished. So that's exactly where things stand heading into what is easily the most important stretch of camp so far. Pads finally go on tomorrow, and every single storyline we just walked through together, Mendoza's response after his roughest day yet, the running back depth question still lingering, the receiver room continuing to sort itself out, the offensive line puzzle still being actively pieced together, all of it gets tested in a completely different way the moment real contact enters this picture. Training camp has this brutal way of humbling you one day and rewarding you the very next. And based on everything I watched unfold today, tomorrow is going to tell us a whole lot more about exactly who this Raiders team actually is underneath all the surface storylines.